On this episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, our topic is colorism and ethnocentrism in the Latinx community. Our speakers are educators, organizers, and anti-racism activists Angelica B. Molina and Annie Rodriguez. This episode originally aired April 7th, 2021.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, man. Once again, welcome to Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. I am Eugene, your co-host. And as usual, I just want to let you know and welcome everybody, and all of those who are new, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm glad that you're here. Race Talk Revolution is a platform which provides for people, it's a platform for all people of races and cultures and lifestyles and backgrounds, to come together. We come together and we join as like-minded people who are tired of living in a country with systemic tension and strife, especially between races and cultures. Here at Race Talk Revolution, we learn how to respectfully talk about the many nuances of racism and to ask questions and to learn from each other's experiences, and also to share our ideas about each of us and how we can make a difference. As you know, as I like to say, here at Race Talk Revolution, your voice matters. Lane?
Yes, so welcome everyone. Welcome to Race Talk. Thank you, Eugene, and welcome our wonderful guests. I will have the pleasure of introducing our guests. Eugene, do me a favor, just keep your eye on the waiting room for me.
I got it.
Thank you. You're always on it. I love it. Our topic today is colorism and ethnocentrism in the Latinx community. The Latinx community is a mixed race group of people with diverse origins and life experiences. And like other BIPOC groups, the effects of colonization continue to create challenges that hinder well-being and community development. This afternoon, we're joined by anti-racist educators and activists, Ms. Annie Rodriguez and Ms. Angelica Benton-Molina. Ms. Rodriguez is founder and manager of Equity Consulting Network, a team of professional development consultants, trainers, community organizers, social workers, and mentor life coaches that represent a racially and culturally diverse network of people with expertise in providing organizational development consulting, racial and social justice and equity training, personal and professional coaching, and a range of other consulting services. Ms. Benton Molina is an educator and workshop presenter committed to the amplification and uplifting of youth voices. She believes that education should give young people a sense of their own inner strength, as well as the tools to make informed and healthy choices that allow them to grow in organic and authentic ways. She includes history and culture as some of the guiding principles in promoting anti-racist leadership development and growth. Ladies, welcome, welcome. Thank you for being here. One of the goals of Race Talk is to provide a platform where people can learn about the nuances of racism from different perspectives. So please, if you would, help us understand some of the nuances of racism that exist in the Latinx community, how they show up, and what the effects are.
Yay. It's nice to meet everyone. And as we begin to talk about race and colorism and internalized racism, I kind of want to take a step back and let Angelica open us up. Look at her face. And give her the stage first, and then yeah.
Good morning. Well, it's still morning here. I'm in Austin, Texas. So good afternoon if that's where you're at too. So one of the things that we talk about, and I work a lot with young people, so anti-racist work, giving them a race analysis. I also am a public health educator, so teaching comprehensive sex ed, and then combining the two so that we understand that everything in our lives, right, is touched by this idea of racism. And we're going to talk about colorism and ethnocentricity as manifestations of that. But one of the things that we hold dear is this idea of cultural sharing. So I think that would be kind of awesome to open up So I grew up in New York City, Black Puerto Rican. My mom's Puerto Rican, my dad's Black. I grew up in New York and very steeped in Puerto Rican culture, which if we think about Puerto Rico, right, it's part of the African diaspora. And so there's a mix of folks, right? When we talk about Puerto Rico, it was the African, the indigenous, were the Tainos that were there, and then the Europeans, and not only Spanish, but other Europeans as well. My family has more Italian background than Spanish, but so one of the things that we talk about though is sharing culture as a way to bring us together. So I'm gonna, if it's okay with Annie, I think I'm gonna sing a song for a second, just to show and share a little bit of culture, because that brings us, it brings us closer together, right? When we understand where we're coming from. So growing up in New York, we go to a lot of demonstrations, right? In New York for the independence of Puerto Rico. We could see what's going on in Puerto Rico, and it's a long history, right, behind that, in terms of what's happening now, right? And how it's been informed by a lot of racist policies throughout history. Against police brutality, that was back in the 90s. So it's like it's not a new thing, it's an ongoing issue. But we used to sing this song, right? So I'm gonna sing it in Spanish and then I'll sing it in English, just to show you how we kind of open up circles a lot of the time, right? And we try to infuse this in our anti-racist organizing because of that pulling together, right? So the song goes like this. Mírala que linda viene, mírala que linda va, la revolución boricua, que no da ni un paso atrás. Si tú pasas por mi casa y tú ves a mi mamá, me le dices que hoy no me esperes, que este movimiento no da un paso atrás. Me le dices que hoy no me esperes, que este movimiento no da un paso atrás. Look at her, a pretty wonder. Don't deny her liberty. Puerto Rico, heart and soul, has always bled tears for me. If you stop over by my house and you see my family, tell them hurry to come along and join us. The revolution started, there will be no defeat. Tell them hurry to come along and join us. The revolution started, there will be no defeat. So I loosely translated that. Thanks. But in terms of undoing, right? We talk about this idea of undoing racism, because if it's something that's been done, it can be undone, right? That one of the principles, and if we're organizing, we should have principles that we're organizing by, right? So that we could all be on the same page in terms of moving forward together. So one of the principles, right, in terms of undoing racism is cultural sharing, right? So in terms of your organizing and your organizations, that's one of the principles that you can bring to it.
That was great, Angelica. Thank you for opening us up with that culture share. So, I want to add, Angelica said that she's from Puerto Rico. My family is also from Puerto Rico. We migrated from Puerto Rico to Florida, also grew up in New York City. Didn't meet Angelica there. I met her in Texas doing anti-racism work. But I wanna share a few slides, and I have to acknowledge I also do work with C Integral, and I'll give you more information about that. An organization that started doing work around Latinos and issues in Latino communities back. I met them in the 90s. I met this group of people. They were called, they started as Casa Latina, Latino Empower. We did Latino empowerment work. And so now we have, C Integral does a workshop called Latinx Challenges. And Latinx, if some of you are familiar, that's a term that's being used. It's really taking out the gender in the Latino. Many times we're genderizing the Latino with the O, which means male, versus the A, which is for the female. It's also inclusive of transgender transmasculine, and it's inclusive of everybody who identifies within Latino communities. So we say Latinx. So I want to share a couple of the slides that we use in the Latinx challenges workshops, so that you could see who we are, right? Because we're from many, many, many different places. So I want to share some slides and then move into the conversations. And this one's in Spanish, so I have to translate while I'm talking to you. So we're 59.9 million. 66% are born here in the United States, and then the other 34%, and this isn't here in the U.S. Other 34% are born in Latin America or other places out of the United States. But 66% of Latinos in the U.S. are born here. We're 18% of the U.S. population right now. In los Estados Unidos, there's projections by 2060 we would be 30.6% of the population, which is another reason why we need to talk about the racialization of the Latinx community and what's happening. We have our consumer potential is $1.7 trillion. We're multinational people from 22 different countries. The majority is from Mexico, 62%, 9.5% again from Puerto Rico, El Salvador, 3.9, Cuba, 3.9, Dominican Republic, 3.5, Guatemala, Colombia, and Honduras. And I know there's some other groups that are missing from there, but that's who we are. We're multi-ethnic and multiracial and multizo, a mixture, right? Of people from many, many other places. The other one I wanted to share is this one, right? These are all the countries that we come from. So you have the Americas. You know, when we talk about the Americas, it's been divided, but America is everything, North and South. But we're talking now South and Central America. And these are all the different countries that our people come from that have been racialized or classified as Latino. That's not the one I wanted to share. This is the other one that I wanted to share because I think it's important that we understand that we begin to, as part of this conversation of who we are as a people. And Angelica said we have indigenous, we have and different indigenous groups from different lands, but then there's our colonizers. Some of them are Spaniards, some of them were Portuguese, but there's also the transatlantic slave trade. I'm looking for that map and it's not there. But when you look at the transatlantic trade slate, and I don't see the map there that I wanted to show you, it shows in the circles within thousands how many enslaved Africans were brought to those countries. And for those of you who have not done a lot of anti-racism work, this was happening for hundreds of years, because many of us know about the enslavement of people here in the United States, but it was happening. I'm trying to stop the share. The transatlantic slave trade was happening in the Caribbean, South America, in the Americas, and in Mexico, because a lot of people don't know that for hundreds of years before what we study here in this country is what happened in Virginia, right? But it was happening for hundreds of years. So I just wanted to say that. So in the workshop, we talk about the racialization of Latino people. One of the things I want to say is that Latinos have never really been a race. We have here in the US, we have never been a race. We're more of an ethnic group, right? And what is an ethnic group? An ethnic group is about culture, more about culture. It's about wherever you are in the world, that this particular group has the same cultural values, cultural norms, cultural ways of being. So this conversation that when Lane contacted me, we wanted to really talk about, so being a people that is multicultural and multiracial, what are some of the dynamics that we need to talk about in these conversations is about racism and how racism manifests. And you could apply this to any different communities, in Black communities, in Asian communities, any people who've been racialized as other, right? As less than. Then we need to have conversations, especially because people have been mixing. When people say, well, I'm half this, half that, there's no such thing. We have been mixing for hundreds of years. So there's really no quantification about what you are, but but there's that mixture. With that being said, I think it's important that we start listening and calling out, or calling in, because we're trying to stop calling people out, but calling them in around what is it that people usually identify when they say, I'm half this, I'm half that. It tends to be with the Spaniards and the Taino and, those lighter skins. And I know for Puerto Ricans, the studying that we've done was that we learned that most of the Tainos were wiped out within 50 years when the colonizers arrived to Puerto Rico. Within 50 years, most of the Tainos were wiped out. So when you see people who have brown skin in Puerto Rico, which is so many, it's because of your ancestral background connection to Africa, right? That our food is very Afrocentric, our music, and most Latin American countries, it is the way, what we value, the way we relate, the way we communicate is very Afrocentric. It comes from that culture in many of the countries. So I want to say that. And as we move forward in this conversation, I want to open with Angelica to talk about anti-Blackness, which is one of the things that we talked about: colorism, ethnocentrism, and anti-Blackness. So I want to explain really quick. Ethnocentrism is when you have people from different ethnic groups, and because of racism, we've been taught to be divided, to fight against each other. And you see it even within the same ethnic groups with Latinos, that they create hierarchies about which Latino group is the best group. And again, with the messaging is that the lighter, more whiter ones, the ones that have mixed more with whiteness, or with the colonizers that looked more white, because they had a caste system in Spain, and there was a caste system. And I tell everybody, study this because it's very, very interesting, that created the hierarchy of the lighter on top, the whiter on top, and the darker at the bottom. And they brought that with them when they came here, right? And so I hope the noise is not too bad. They're doing some yard work outside. And so they brought that with them. And then the messages that we received at home, in school, in our communities, was the issue around colorism. And the whiter and lighter you were, the more beautiful you were, the more desirable you were. You were maybe the one that was going to go to college. And so all these messages, and so there was an anti-Blackness even growing up within our own families. And how does that impact as it relates to this work that we're trying to do? So there was the issue of colorism and the issue of ethnocentrism, where even within racialized groups, and you wonder why all the different Latino communities can't come together, because we've bought into this ethnocentrism within even our own Latino communities, right? And part of the work is when oppressed people get oppressed, they tend to oppress other people sometimes, right? So how do we kind of get the divisiveness that's happening? My work is really to get not just Latinx people, but other people to understand how the work that we're doing currently is dividing our communities, right? What's this thing about white Latinx and Black Latinx? That's a new thing, right? And so for white people, how many white people's ancestors came to this country as white? Who knows the history? What did your white people come to this country as? What did your people come to this country as? Put it in the chat. What did your people come to this country as? Because for those of you who raised your hand, I would say to do some history. No group of people came to this country as white. People came as Italians, they came as Germans, they came as Irish, Czechoslovakian, you know, all these different groups. And what happened, right? And what happened was then people were racialized and learned the history that's in English and Scottish, right? And what happened was, and people, when they got here, they were treated really bad. That's why history is so important. Every immigrant group, what you hear now with Latinos, happened to your ancestors. Every immigrant group that came here got treated really poorly, but they went through a process, right? So every time that the numbers of white people became less and less, they needed some new white folks. I say we need some new white folks up in here, right? And so each immigrant group became white. Sorry. What group of people can't become white in this country? There's only one group of people who could never become white. And so that's Black people, right? And so when we say that, when they started predicting that Latinos were going to be the next majority minority, which doesn't make sense, right? What happens is that we need, if Latinos are going to be the majority minority and be like 30 to 35% of the population, imagine if Latinos and Black people and Asian people and indigenous people came together and started organizing. What would happen in this country, right? What would happen? And so when there's a threat to the white population, the numbers may be less, and that white people would be under 40, I think like 45%. The predictions keep changing, right? So, and that white people would be less than 50% of the population. We need some new white people in here. So what started happening is that they started putting in places for Latino. First of all, they changed the census, and they changed the questioning of the census and the way the question was asked, that historically, since the census began, Latinos would never identify as white. We would identify as other, and then our ethnic background, our country, and our ethnic background. When they flipped the question around, what is your ethnicity first? Latinos would say Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican. And then the race question became the second question. Some Latinx people started identifying as white. And for us to understand that it's not just about numbers, it's a political, it's a racial, we call it a racial social engineering to keep white as the majority in this country, which is what's happening. So again, part of the work is to understand what's being done, why it's being done. And I want to kind of let you talk a minute, Angelica. I know I've been going for a minute. But the impact that has on our communities as it's dividing us, because we're so mixed. I have siblings that look like Angelica, nephews and nieces that look like Crystal, that may look like Norman. But then I also have some family that looks like Marcy and like Jason, right? And so we're so mixed. And what's happening is that there's a divisiveness within our own communities about who's the better Latino, right? Who's going to get access? And they sometimes even, oh, please stop that. It's not because you're dark skinned, right? And so all these issues that we have in our own communities, and what's happening is that it's dividing us, and it's getting us to be divided. You know, divide and conquer. If you can divide and conquer, take the light-skinned Latinos and get them to identify as white, white will continue to be the majority in this country. But for Latinos to also understand the loss. How many of folks who are...
You muted yourself.
Sorry, I didn't even touch it. How many Latinos who how many folks who identify as white speak the language of their ancestors? How many of you, if you can just put your hands up, how many of you speak the language of your ancestors? Very few, right? How many folks? And so the buying into whiteness, I know for my people, that's one of the things that I'm fighting for. Buying into this means giving up your language, giving up the culture, giving up the ways of being, right? The way we communicate with each other, the food, The music. Oh, you can't play that music only for certain parties because it's too loud. You can't. Oh, when you speak and you use your hands like that, it makes me nervous. So what happens is you start holding back, right? You can't be your true authentic selves when you buy into this. And so for me, that's part of really importance of this work, is for us to understand that it's a dehumanizing process to buy into this. But it's also creating a divisiveness within the organizing work that I want to say with my brother, not just with my Afro-Latino brothers and sisters, but with my communities of African American and Black people. Because if we're not clear about who we are in our place and we're aligning with whiteness, then people are going to be like, well, you think you're saying you're white, you're trying to be white, but now you're trying to say you're getting discriminated. It creates, right? It creates barriers to organizing in our communities, especially organizing with other communities of color. So I just wanted to add to that. Angelica, I kind of want to bring you in. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about colorism and just some examples.
Yeah.
From my life and things that I've also heard other people talk about in terms of colorism. But yeah, so growing up, Puerto Rican in New York, one of the things that I heard a lot, and I was probably the darkest in my immediate family, and I wasn't told this from my family, but I heard it in our community, was that this idea of mejorar la raza, right? Mejorar la raza, to better the race, right? That's what it literally means, is to better the race. And it was this idea that you would marry, so for me, I would marry somebody lighter, somebody who had that more white phenotypes, right? Lighter skin and straighter hair, all this, so that my children could be, closer to whiteness, right? Closer to white, so that then they can have more access to those right privileges that comes with being white in the U.S., right? And then on the flip side of that was, ¿y tu abuela dónde está? Because people, don't understand genetics, right? And the idea of race is, this whole idea of race was a pseudoscience. So we've taken a lie, right, that has been very good lie that was weaved in, centuries ago by so-called scientists, who then later on dispelled it, but it's still, right, it served the white power collective to continue with this lie to, right, not only justify slavery, the enslavement of Africans, right, but to maintain the power in the hands of the few white elite, mostly, right? Because they were white, a lot of the white folks or Europeans who were coming over were poor, right? Were poor, but in terms of the whole divide and conquer that Annie was talking about, right? To have those folks identify with whiteness, despite the fact that it's not serving them, right, as poor folks, was very, very beneficial to the folks who were in power, right? And we see that happening still now. But yeah, the flip side of that was, ¿y tu abuela dónde está, right? So that you might try to mejorar la raza, you may be trying to better the race, and then genetically, right, your kid comes out, right, darker. And so that whole thing is very twisted in terms of the ideas that we are fed. And I know I lived in New Orleans for a little while, and there it was the whole brown paper bag test, right? And so that in terms of churches and certain organizations, the sororities, fraternities and stuff like that, to be able to be part of that, right, as a Black person, you had to be lighter than this paper bag, right? And we still see that going on with organizations and groups too. It's not as blatant, right? But there's a lot of subtleties to it, right? That still come from that perspective. Fine tooth comb test and all of these different things that we were fed and taught. And I'm grateful now there are more images of Black folks kind of, just in their natural state and loving their skin tones, whatever it is, so that my child doesn't have the same things that I had growing up. And hopefully, it'll get even better, right? The thing I see in terms of ethnocentricity here, so growing up in New York, I could walk down the streets of El Barrio, and because there was a bigger pool of folks of African descent who were Latino or Latinx, people would speak to me in Spanish, right? I moved to Texas from Louisiana, from New Orleans, and the division between Latinos and Black folks here, right, is palpable. It sent me really into a culture shock. Not to say that there isn't manifestations of racism happening in New York that also serve to divide us. But here there's this really, really stark difference, right? This used to be Mexico. People kind of forget that, right? And so there were Mexicanos that were living here when all of a sudden this border was drawn, and now it's the United States, United States of Texas. No, now it's the United States, right? But the whole power grid thing threw me for a loop. But so then you have, right, Latinos that have been living here for generations, right? Prior, way before this was the United States, but the thought process, right, and the manifestations of racism coming from a lot of the Latino communities here is that, oh no, like I'm from here, I'm not from there, right? Meaning Mexico, meaning the other side of the border, right? There's like this stark differentiation. Same people, right? But there's this idea that somehow, because now this is the United States and I'm here and I didn't migrate here, that I'm better, right? That I'm better and that I'm closer to whiteness. I had to translate for this youth organization kind of that was part of the city that I worked for. And it was a mother and her son came in to be registered for the program.
Yeah, that's what it is.
And the person who was the coordinator, right, who asked me to translate, and came to on their registration form, when it came to the question of race, she asked me, so I translated, and she's like, well, most people put white. Now these folks were from Guatemala. They were like a little bit even darker than me, but to put white on the form as a white Latino it's obviously a misnomer, but it's also it hurts, right? It hurts the community, because then if you're talking about resources, right, and you're talking about data and the segregated data based on race, then we're not being truthful, right, about who's living where. And that happened, that happened in Puerto Rico. I don't know the numbers for this past census, but the one prior, right, I think it was something like 80% of folks in Puerto Rico put white. You go to the island, or even in New York, most of the Puerto Ricans are not white, but like Annie's talking about, that moves that white collective to have more numbers, right? And so then those in the racial hierarchy, those folks who identify closer to white, then they start getting more goodies, right? They start getting more privilege. They start getting more access. They start getting those positions, right? Of some power. They start becoming bigger and bigger gatekeepers in terms of being able to allow people in or shut people out.
Angelica,
ladies.
can I add real quickly?
Absolutely, Annie,
that
and then let's go
the
to Q&A.
goodies, that what we have to understand is that the goodies come at a cost. right? And that's that dehumanizing process, that if you want to get access into the institutions, into these organizations, they come at a cost. The cost is don't speak your language unless we need you to translate. Besides that, don't act that way, don't talk the way you work with your community has to happen in ways that are not the way I would, right? So you have to give up so much. And I want to put, that it's important that we understand that. And that's why I ask white people, where'd your ancestors come from? Do you speak the language? Do you know the cultural values, the norms, ways of being, right? Many of that has been given up into what we would call white cultural values and norms to get the goodies. So people gave up a lot in order to get access. But the other important side of that is that we are so multicultural and so multiracial, and to understand the impact that has on our own families, on our own communities, on our own organizing. And those of you who work in institutions, how does that manifest in your institution? Who's getting the raise? How are Latinos being divided and pitted against the Black community or the Asians or all this? How is it even happening within our own communities, right? Because Angelica is a darker skinned Latina. I might get the raise. I might get the position, and I might not get a raise, but I might just get the nice desk that's closer to the front, so that when I represent the organization as a Latina, I represent looking like this, not looking Black the way Angelica looks, right? And so I just needed to add that it's at a cost.
Yeah,
and it's political.
It's really important. Somebody put in the chat, gave up our humanity, and that's exactly what Annie's talking about. And we usually think about it dehumanizing Black folks and people of color, but it also dehumanizes white folks.
That's right.
Absolutely, that's right. It does. Ladies, thank you for this information. I'm loving this. I didn't know that you all had the brown paper bag test in the Latinx community also.
Well, I think that was more in New Orleans.
No, it's all right.
There's different, there was different ways of doing that. Like Annie was saying, the caste system.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like if you go to the palace in the DF in Mexico City, right? The plaza, there's a museum there. There used to be that caste system is, I mean, I don't know who spent the time doing this, because there's actually detailed drawings, right? Of you were I can't remember the names, Octagon or Meta de Patra, or yes. I mean, there was all these crazy names. Oh yeah, okay, yes. So Annie put it there on the screen. There's all these crazy names and drawings of what folks would look like in these different mixes, and it's laid out in terms of who is on top. So the same race hierarchy, but in this caste system, and there's so many of them, and it's so detailed that it's insane, you know?
So let's take some questions. I know there are some questions, and just a reminder, we have such a short period of time today because these ladies have just been so dynamic with the information, and just keep your questions as short as you can, please, and let's get it going. Eugene, I'll let you handle the rest of this Q&A.
All righty, ladies, thank you so very much. We have Felicia Williams-Cozy up first, and then Adine, and then Crystal. Felicia?
So I really appreciate you bringing forward all of the information today that helps me as an African American understand more the similarities in our plight. I lived in Venezuela for 7 years, and one of the things that was awesome to me there was seeing the range of people and even all of the different names that they had for the different colors. So it wasn't just Black and white, it was Morena and everything in between. The one question that I have that I think is confusing for a lot of people is the use of the term Latino versus Hispanic. So could you please clarify that for us, so as a group we get clear on the difference in those two?
Yeah.
And also, if you have any suggestions on how to bring African Americans and Latinos closer together in our work, I would also like to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia.
So the Hispanic, the Hispanic was a label that was giving to us based on our colonizers, Spanish, right? And the Latino came from organizing, and it came from our real connection more to Latin America, the Caribbean islands, that map I showed. Because we're more, so it came from organizing, from people saying, well, this is not who we are. We are not of Spain. Our culture, we're like, the only thing that we really have is the language, the Spanish language. But culturally, everything about who we are is more connected to Latin America, and the history that we come from those places of mixing with Latin American, the African, and all of that. So it came from organizing, and which then moved into the Latinx. I don't know if you were here yet, Felicia. The Latinx, which is really of bringing together men, women, transgender, gay, everybody.
Yeah, because everybody in Latin America doesn't speak Spanish, like Annie was saying before. Portuguese, right? You got Belize. Belize is in Latin America, and people speak English, right? Jamaica is in Haiti, speak French, or so we have because words are important, right? Just like Annie was saying, the word minority. Nobody's less than. So why do we use the word minority for people of color, right? Or BIPOC folks, right? And then, like she was saying, the majority minority, that makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
So you're still calling people less than. They're more in numbers, but they're still less than, right? Than the white collective. And then so Latino, so it's more like Latin American in terms of, like, I think Romance languages too kind of play into that. But we also talk about Hispanic as being like his panic, like whose panic are we talking about, And then the last thing I was going to say real fast is that there's people in Latin America who don't have any European ancestry, right? There was a guy in Mexico who wrote a whole editorial about how he didn't have any kind of European, so to call him Hispanic would be a total misnomer, right? So he was from indigenous, mostly indigenous, a little bit of African ancestry, but he didn't, so that's the,
And to answer the question about organizing, Eugene, is to begin to have these conversations. We're just ignorant sometimes. We don't know. We don't understand what the racial construct is, what it's doing to us. And that is very, very intentional to keep us from coming together. We've got to keep every racialized group from coming together with Black people, because imagine the power and how we could change this country.
Right. Thank you so very much. Adine, you're next, and then we have Crystal, then Luis, and then Mrs. Cobb. Adine?
Wow, this is one of the most powerful presentations I've heard, and for me, it's very emotional. My roots are New Orleans, and I've always been ashamed of it. The stupidity and the evil nature of the colorism that comes from fair-skinned Blacks in a place like New Orleans is it's crippling. It weakens our Black community to the point where we are more vulnerable to white racism because of it. The other thing I want to say is, a number of years ago, I met a lovely Black woman from Brazil. We met at a conference, and in the process of becoming friends, she just stopped and asked me, "What are you?" And I said, "I'm Black." And she said, "Oh, in Brazil, you would never admit to that." And I wanted to cry.
Yeah.
There's a lot of manifestations of racism. I mean, we're talking about colorism and ethnocentricity, but there's, tons of shame, right? People have immense shame in terms of the way that they've internalized the messages about what it means to be Black, right? And so shame, comes from that distancing, where we don't want to be part of our community anymore, right? And so folks when we've seen the history of that, of folks who have been able to pass, had done that a lot of times for their own survival too, right? So there's a lot in there. It's not only about people wanting to not be Black, but it's about how did we maintain also, So and that's a lot of history, but yeah.
Thank you. We have Crystal, then we have Luis, and then Mrs. Cobb, Mr. or Mrs. Cobb will be the last question because of the interest of time. Crystal?
Right. So I actually want to bring more of a comment. I appreciate this forum very much so. And I know I sit before you guys probably looking like one of the mulattoes or Spanish people. And I appreciate Angelica and Annie for having at least a New York twist. I grew up in the Bronx, born and raised. My mom was indigenous to this country as a Cherokee Indian, and her family escaping, coming to the North. So I pair well with the conversation that we're talking about. And so for growing up in the Bronx, everyone thought I was Puerto Rican. Of course, I talk with my hands, and I don't fall back on that because this is how we express ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
To the point of the caste system, and I know probably you were going to raise this at the end, but you have Isabel Wilkerson, who has the book The Caste, which is a phenomenal read, and obviously right now she's touring and so forth. No, this is not. I'm not a publicist for her, but there's also this book that I brought for my own kids called Presidential, which is by Margaret Kimberly, and she breaks down the system of how they wanted to keep us separate and how they wanted to make sure. And this is just from president to president to president to president, and how the U.S. have ensured that slavery continued in the judicial, I should say, in democracy, period. I'll put the information in the chat. It's a great read. It's something that I have 4 sons, all African American, Caribbean American. We're very mixed in this family.
Right.
So I just want them to understand how from time to time it was prevalent for them to keep us in this box. And now that we are where we are in America, and especially the Zoom we would have never crossed paths if this wasn't. So we take the good with the bad and the indifferent. So I just wanted to render that, and I'll end there because I know we're pressed for time.
Crystal, thank you so very much. Professor Luis, remember to keep our comments and questions down to a minute.
What a time to get stuck here. Angelica and Ann, I'd like to invite you both for dinner at my house tonight, any night you want. Really, if you're ever close to New York City, you got to come, because I live in a well-to-do area in Westchester, which I don't like because there's no community here after growing up in Harlem and living in Puerto Rico for many years. There's no community here. And if all of you listening, check out the Journal News today in Westchester. By coincidence, there's a picture of me and an article on what you're talking about. There's a picture of me in front of the Puerto Rican flag, because I've been asked to move from where I am and go back to New York City. I have a Puerto Rican flag in front of the house, and they tell me to take it out, and I should put in the real American flag. So I know what you're going through. So what they did is made me permanently live here. I'm never going to move, and my kids have to follow me from this. I also wrote a book, I don't know if you called An Other's Mind, which is what it is to be an other, because that's the only box I could have checked off. And my mother came here specifically to avoid being sterilized. I'm also very upset, and I want to get your feedback on this. I was very upset with the Congresswoman Velez when she signed a contract that says that Puerto Rico owed the United States billions of dollars. That is a disgrace. Is the United States that owes Puerto Rico money? They don't even pay taxes when they open up a corporation. The United States has swindled us, has taken advantage, have abused us, exploited us. And how dare anybody say that we owe this country money? It is thievery. And for her to have signed that, people always say, well, you're going to go on, you're going to be poor. And I always say, if I'm going to be poor, it has to be my fault. and we need to be independent. So, you know, I could go on forever, but we need our independence. And the theory that it's 50-50 in the country, Puerto Rico, that's nonsense. Everybody wants, most of the people that I know don't want to be part of the state. It's just that we don't even go out to vote for it.
Yeah. Can I jump in? Because I know we're kind of really tight, really tight on time. I want to, because I know we're kind of like, okay. So that, again, those are conversations we need to have. People don't know these things. We have to learn. We have to learn the history of not just Puerto Rico, all our countries, the colonization, the way people are being treated. When you hear people coming from South and Central America, what impact are we having on their country that forces people to come here, and then we don't want them here? Our military, our colonizing, our military, we are involved in all of that. And then again, what are the conversations we're not having, even about Puerto Rico, when Angelica said 86% of Puerto Ricans identified as white? Do you think the president, our past president, saw our people as white when he threw paper towels at them? That was such a disrespectful move to people. And our country, there's still parts of our country that still doesn't have water. The homes are still in disrepair. And so again, the way that we change is by coming together, having these conversations, read books, learn history. Glenn, I have a list of books I can share with you that are really good about history. There's a saying, an African saying, it has to do with the Maafa, that the only way forward is to look back. We can't move forward if we don't. And Kofa, right? We will Sankofa. We will keep repeating history over and over and over again because we're not looking back. We are doing the same mistakes. And even sometimes we know these things and we forget. So we have to continue to move forward and learn from each other and grow and have these conversations, create spaces where we can have difficult. Let me tell you, sitting down with Black people and other oppressed groups of people is hard. We fight each other harder than we fight white folks.
It's crazy.
Right? I see you, Felicia. So how do you create these types of spaces where we can have these kind of conversations and know that no matter how pissed off we get in the moment, we've got to come back.
That's right.
This is a long haul work. This ain't gonna happen overnight.
And understand that it has changed, you know, so we're not in, you know, Black folks aren't enslaved anymore, but we do have to, with history, we also need to know the laws that this country, you know, lives by. So it's sad when I ask high schoolers, what does the 13th Amendment say? What does the 14th Amendment say, right? And then understanding that the things that folks have fought for and organized around are trying to be dismantled, and how things have changed, right, form and color to fit, right, the folks in power, right? Luis, I've done I do a lot around reproductive justice, and I did a presentation and piece around racism and sexual health, and La Operación, which was a movie that was put out about sterilization in Puerto Rico. It was a horrible thing, right? And so this country Puerto Rico was annexed by this country right after the Spanish-American War, and then went in, and over 100, it was like, I think 150,000 women were sterilized without their consent. And it's still happening today, right? We see that in the detention centers happening.
Ladies.
Where folks are being, I know, we got to wrap up, I'm sorry.
Ladies.
But yes.
Can I say
that could be a different show,
Well, hang on. I want to give both Annie and Angelica the opportunity to share whatever you want to share, and then we're just going to go close this out. All right.
I want to say one thing, and it's a response to something that Sulma said in the chat about her mother, and she had to teach her mother about being Black and the resistance of Arturo. That's the other thing that we have to talk about. We talk about that in the Latinx challenges, and I'm going to share that information right now about the training. We have to teach our children that there's heroes and sheroes from our countries, that our people were not just always these oppressed people, right? That they were kings and queens, and they were heroes, and they fought, that there was resistance,
Right.
right? That the children it will just change their whole mindset about who they are and to be proud of who they are if we start teaching them a different history. So I want to end with that these conversations also have to happen with our children. It can't just be the adults.
And I'm so grateful to be here today, and I'm so honored that I was asked, that Annie asked me, and that I got to connect with Lane and Eugene. Eugene, my dad's middle name was Eugene, and he's, you know, with the ancestors now, so that's a beautiful thing. And I think for me also the challenge to white folks, you know, because a lot of the times it's about, oh, you know, what are the Black folks saying about race and racism? What should we do, right? I think part of it is for white folks to look at their history, like Annie's saying, but look at the history prior also to the United States, because a lot of there's a really good book about trauma, right? My grandmother's hand that Venesma Meneke put out, that a lot of the trauma it's been like, you know, from generations back prior to the United States too. Right. So what are we holding on to, and what do we need to let go? Right. Yes. And then that Black folks, we need to study the history of oppression here, but we need to study also our history prior to that and teach our kids, because they're not teaching them in school. Right. The Mali Empire, right. The Song Empire, all of these empires that existed, Timbuktu, the knowledge that we had that existed way prior to the United States of America.
They came before Columbus, you know, stuff like that. Yeah. Ladies, thank you so very much. Mrs. Cobb, Mr. and Mrs. Cobb, I am so sorry that we didn't get a chance to get to you. My apologies on that. Lane, close us out. Let us know what's up for next week, please.
Yeah, well, indeed, ladies, I would love for you to come back. And Annie, did you put the link to the workshop in, or did you just put the name? Okay. So
I put two links. They're right next to each other.
Good.
One is a description of the workshop, C Integral. The other one, we're having a workshop April 28th and 29th. There's a registration page. I think there's only about 10 spaces left. So if you're interested, you got to hurry up and register. It's going to close soon.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Come back next week, guys, when our guest will be Imam Earl S. El Amin, and he's going to talk about bias and religious misinformation. And this is going to be a big one, and it's going to be awesome. So please show up, bring your friends, bring your family, bring your colleagues. Ladies, can't thank you enough for being here. We love you. Eugene, I love you too. All right.
Love you too, Lane. Thank you, everyone. Everybody. Bye now.